All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Last time we reviewed 1 through 5, or at least 1 through 4, and then finished up 5. Let's just really quickly review 5, and then we'll move on to 6 and 7. So 5, if you guys remember, you have to have an indictment. You can't just be arrested for no reason. If you are a member of the military the land and naval forces, as well as the militia, and you are currently active, right, in a war situation or something along those lines, you will not be tried in the public courts, but you will be tried in the naval courts or army courts or whatever else, right? Whatever that is. And so you won't be in the normal system for that. You can't be tried. Remember double jeopardy. We talked about O.J. Simpson. Here he is, right? You can't be tried for the same crime twice, which is why his former in-laws couldn't charge him or try him for the murder of their daughter. They had to go with the abuse route after after he was found innocent, right, in the murder of their daughter, right? You have the right to not incriminate yourself, right? Meaning that if an answer is going to shed a horrible light on you or ruin your reputation or business or anything like that, you can just say, I plead the fifth, and not answer that. Remember, I also mentioned that if you are being charged with this and you're on trial and you take the stand, you say, I plead the fifth, it makes you look guilty. And and the jury is probably going to see it that way, right? So just keep that in mind when you're talking about pleading the fifth there, right? And then you get due process, right? That's this whole idea here. You get the chance to be heard. The evidence has to be provided. You get this trial, etc., and that cannot be denied. We're going to talk a little bit more about that due process and what that entails in the Sixth Amendment here, actually. And then finally, the right to eminent domain, right? The state can take your property for something of public value as long as they give you compensation for that. And what is just compensation, right? And we talked about that case with I think it was in Virginia or South Carolina, where all that land was seized for a public project. They paid the people out, the people left, and then they bulldozed all the homes, and then the project didn't get approved by the county, and so then they did nothing. They just destroyed these homes for no reason. The people opened up a lawsuit against the county as a result of that. Okay, so there has to be some sort of compensation there, and there has to be actual public use, which was their argument, that their homes were bulldozed and there was no public use and they felt targeted, et cetera, and then they went to court on that. I forget how that ruled, or if it may even still be going. I'm not 100% sure. Okay, so that's going to bring us then to the Sixth Amendment. Okay, and so let's just go through this and kind of break this down a little at a time, and then we'll talk about an interesting case that's currently ongoing where the defendant believes that their Sixth Amendment rights have been violated, and we'll open it up to you guys to have a conversation about that, whether you agree or whether you disagree with that, with their claim. Okay, so it says in all criminal prosecutions. So when we say criminal prosecutions, that means you've been accused of a crime, right? And you're going to court over that pursuant to Amendment 5 and your rights. Okay. The accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. That means that they cannot arrest you for a crime, try you, and then do it privately so that nobody can find out what is going on with that case, and then sentence you and say that they have evidence which they do not allow people to see, right? They don't allow the public to see that. Okay. So the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. And this is kind of a big part of this. Remember where it was committed. When we talked about the Revolutionary War and just prior to it, if you wanted to take a British officer to court because they violated your rights, they came in, they confiscated your stuff, and you didn't feel that was appropriate, they claimed it was smuggled, it wasn't, or whatever else. Remember that by the end of that, right before the war started, you couldn't even go to court for that in the Americas. You actually had to go to England in most cases to go to trial. And we talked about how that was was something that was impossible for most colonists to do, which means that they just had to like accept the the situation, and they couldn't do anything about that. So when you commit a crime, you will be then tried in the place where you committed the crime. And there was that situation. It's funny, actually. I'm going to talk about two Idaho cases here, but there was that situation with that guy who killed, I forget, or allegedly killed those college kids in Idaho, and he fled. And I think they found him in Pennsylvania or Maryland or something like that, or maybe Delaware, somewhere back east is where he ended up being found. And then for the trial, they shipped him back to Idaho to start that trial, right? Because he's going to be tried where the crimes were committed. I'm not saying that he did it or not, right? But he's the kind of like the number one suspect in this, and so there you go. Anyways, so you can be tried where the crime was allegedly committed. And then the other thing here is an impartial jury. This is a big, big deal, right? Like, can you say that the jury is impartial? I would make the argument that nobody's impartial, right? Like, you can't let go of your personal bias or preference or beliefs or whatever else. It's really challenging to do that in a case and just look at it like, what's the actual evidence say? Not what do I think, right? Do I think that OJ was guilty? Do I not think that OJ was guilty? What does the evidence say? And that is a challenging conversation to have, like, with yourself and with other jury members. But when we look at some of these cases, like especially in the South, where black men were accused of crimes and then and then they go to court and then they have it, right? They try and exercise their right to an impartial jury, and then the jury is full of a bunch of white men, half of whom are KKK members. Can we say that they got an impartial trial? Absolutely not, right? So if you can prove that, then obviously you can have the court reopen the case or whatever. But that's a big deal. Now, in that, when they choose those jury members, right, they go through this whole process, and the prosecution and the defense, they get this whole group of people who get called, and then the prosecution and defense can eliminate people from that jury list that they think might be overly harsh or might overly control the conversation about whether the person is guilty or innocent. Okay. And if you want to get into some of this too, like the whole trial thing and the injustices that were in the South, especially during the segregation years and things like that, right? Take a look at To Kill a Mockingbird, right? It really does a great job of that. There's also a movie, what is it called? I think it's called Time to Kill. Maybe I'm wrong here. Time to Kill, with Matthew McConaughey, and he's a lawyer and dealing with some of the same stuff. I'm probably wrong on the name of that one, and it's probably rated R, so you probably can't watch it anyways. But there's plenty of stuff out there, and you can look into that and kind of experience that, right? So an impartial jury is an important part. And going back to the colonists, right, we even talked about this, but when they had to go to England to go to trial, and the jury was full of a bunch of British people or British officers and things like that, are they getting an impartial jury? No, not at all, which is why that section is in there. It has to be where the crime was committed and by an as impartial as you can get from a jury, right? Which justice shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. So when you get arrested, or I shouldn't say when you get arrested, because you guys, you're a bunch of criminals. No, when you get arrested, right, or if you get arrested for anything, right, they have to tell you what that's for. They don't necessarily have to tell you the second they're arresting you, right? But they have to tell you. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's within 48 hours, but it might be 72 hours. They have to tell you. And if they have not told you within that time frame and they're holding you, they have to release you. There is no other alternative there. They have to. And if they do not, your constitutional rights have been violated and you can file suit. Now, there is one exception to this, and it's one of the pieces, and I think I brought it up before, but it's a piece of legislation that was passed shortly after 9/11, and really it is in many ways one of the more unconstitutional things that's been passed in my lifetime, and that is the Patriot Act. And under the Patriot Act, if you are suspected of being a terrorist, they can more or less, and there's some gray area here, but they can more or less hold you indefinitely, which should scare you, right? That should scare you that the government can say, oh, well, Patriot Act, we think this guy is a terrorist, and then they can throw you in jail for, forever, for the rest of your life. That is, again, unconstitutional and should scare you. Now, typically, the Patriot Act is not used on or with American citizens, but even then, that I don't know that I think that makes it any better, right? The fact that it's being done, right? So you have the right to be informed of the nature and cause of your accusation, to be confronted with witnesses, right? So they can't just say like, oh, hey, like we think you did this, like we're arresting you. They have to have witnesses and, right, like evidence to suggest that you should be arrested, going back to the warrants that we talked about in the previous amendments, right, like 4 and 5. They have to have that before they can arrest you. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in your favor, meaning that you are allowed to get witnesses to come and testify on your behalf, and to some extent they can be forced to come and attend the trial and testify for you. Again, though, right, with the Fifth Amendment, they can avoid saying things that are going to shed a poor light on them or destroy their reputation or whatever else, right? They can do that, or they can refuse to talk about that, but otherwise you can get witnesses. And if you are denied getting witnesses, then they have violated your constitutional rights. Going back to the court cases pre-American Revolution, where you weren't allowed to present witnesses, and the jury would just essentially, or the judge would just essentially decide your guilt regardless of any evidence, right? And to have the assistance of counsel for their defense. So essentially, right, you guys have all heard it, like in the crime shows, wherever, you have the right to an attorney. That's what that means. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, the state will provide one for you. Now, obviously, that's not going to be, right, that's not going to be OJ's lawyer, right? That guy does not get out of bed for less than $1 million, right? So then the state's not going to pay that. So you're going to get just some, defense attorney that's assigned to the case, district defense attorney or something along those lines, and they may be really good and talented, but again, they're not going to be someone that the government's going to have to spend a lot of money on, right? So that's the breakdown of the Sixth Amendment there, right, guys? So the big things here: you have the right to a speedy and public trial. You have the right to a jury, to be tried where the law was committed or the crime was committed. In other words, right, like think about that segregation era, and we talked about how black people couldn't get a fair trial in the South. If you committed a crime in North Dakota, they couldn't transport you down to Missouri, where they were guaranteed to get a guilty conviction out of you from the jury, right? They couldn't do that. It has to be where the crime was committed, okay? You have the right to know why you're being arrested. Again, that doesn't have to happen immediately, but it does have to happen within like 48 to 72 hours, somewhere in that window, right? And if they don't, then you have to be released. And if they don't release you, they have violated your rights, and you can file suit, right? Okay. And then you have the right to have witnesses, okay, both for or against you. And then you have the right for counsel, or the right to an attorney. Okay. Now, there's a really interesting case that's going on right now, and I don't know if you guys know too much about it. I haven't talked about it a lot in this class because it's kind of older, but it's come back into light in the last week, honestly, probably last week or two. And that's the case dealing with Lori Vallow Daybell, seen here. Now, allegedly, her and her husband conspired to and killed Lori's ex-husband, her brother, and their 2 children, allegedly, right? I don't actually know. There's actually a whole Netflix series thing on it. Obviously TV mature, but if your parents are willing to let you watch that, because of the violent nature of the crimes, that's why it's TV mature, right? But if they're okay with that, then check it out. But as I understand, and I'm not super savvy with this case, or why they necessarily did it, but her husband believed that he was some sort of like prophet or Jesus Christ reincarnated or something along those lines, and essentially convinced her to participate in doing these things. Anyways, so they were going to be tried separately, and he was doing everything that he could do to try and postpone the trial as long as possible, right? To push back the dates as often as possible. And then she, when they got her, was was emotionally a mess, as I'm sure anyone may be if right, if they had participated in the killing of their ex-husband, their brother, and their children, right? And so her lawyer argued that she wasn't fit to stand trial, and the result of that is that they postponed doing the trial while they essentially tried to get her like emotionally and mentally to stabilize and move forward. Now things have changed, and they're actually going to be trying them together, which means that she can't really claim the like insanity thing, because if one of them is guilty, then both of them are guilty. But she filed an injunction, if I'm not mistaken, last week, where she was saying that she was denied her Sixth Amendment rights because she was denied the right to a public and speedy trial when they put this trial on hold so that they could kind of like get her in a better emotional space or whatever, because claiming insanity and different things like that, right? She claims that is a violation of that aspect. Now, this happened like 3 years ago, I think, something like that, right? That I think she was initially arrested and things like that. And so it brings up a very, very interesting problem with this amendment. Because speedy, and I mean, public is public, right? That's pretty obvious. But is speedy defined in any way, shape, or form in this amendment? It's almost like when we were talking about the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms. Is that defined? What are the limitations for that? Are there limitations? Right, etc. What's going on here? And the interesting thing too about this is what is speedy to one person may not be speedy to another, right? And so these court cases, by the way, can sometimes take years and years and years because of all of the processing. Like they have to give people time to do the research. They have to give people time to do the investigation. They have to schedule time with the courts, the jury, like all of this stuff, right? These cases can go on for years sometimes. Like even to the point where I'm trying to think of, there was like this guy that was convicted of a bunch of murders, not Manson, but somebody else. And but anyways, convicted of all these murders, right? So the whole process from the time that he got arrested till the time that he finally was like executed, because it was in a state where that was legal, that whole process took something like 10 years, right? So it like, what is speedy? What isn't speedy here? And that's the problem. How do we measure that in regards to her case? Okay, so I want you guys to just think about this for a second and maybe have a discussion here amongst yourselves. How do we define, what do you think is an appropriate amount? Because if we do it too fast, then there's no way for anybody to investigate and collect the information and really be able to assess guilt, right? So what do you think is an appropriate time frame to investigate a murder and track down all the leads and get all the evidence and all of that kind of stuff? Go ahead and have that discussion. Take about 5 minutes right now. Hit pause now. All right, I'm assuming that you guys have had that discussion about, what should be appropriate. Is 10 years too long? Is 3 years in her case too long? Is 6 months too long? I don't know. It's hard to say, and obviously, right, anytime sitting there in prison, especially if you're innocent, probably feels too long, right? But it does take time to prepare these cases. Okay. So with that, we're going to move on to Amendment 7, and you can tell that I just did a fantastic job with this slide here. And this one is, or says that in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Okay, so essentially what this is saying is, before when we were talking criminal cases, right? All those things that we were talking about were criminal cases, meaning that you're being charged with some sort of a crime, murder, as it was with OJ and Lori Daybell, right? But it could be anything that you're being tried with. Okay, that's the rules for those criminal cases. Okay, this is saying in suits at common law that you get the same rules. So essentially what they mean by suits of common law, and I think I used the example here, but like if I wanted to take my neighbor to court because he damaged my fence, right? I can do that, and I am guaranteed all of these same rights, and he is guaranteed all of these same rights that existed in the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. And we would call that a common law situation there, okay? And so all that's going to be preserved, okay? You have those same things. You can do it by jury. And then what I think is interesting here is that it says in controversy shall exceed $20. So if it's more than $20 in damage. What's fascinating is this was written in like 1789. $20 was a lot more in 1789 than it is today. It's significantly more, right? And so I think it's interesting that this amount here, this $20, that there is no account for inflation in that, because really at this point, what does that mean? That means you could take somebody to court and have the jury and all those things for almost anything you want, because $20 is nothing, right? Now, obviously, and I think I used the example in at least one or two of my classes, the situation with my fence where my neighbor damaged our fence, right? And to replace those panels was like $50 to $100 or something like that, right? So I just bought the panels, because at the end of the day, hiring an attorney to go to court to make him pay the $100 or whatever, $50 to $100 or whatever it cost, right, is significantly more than the cost of the fence, of fixing the fence, right? So even though you can do it for like $20, it's not a wise decision, because your attorney fees are going to be so much more than what you're actually going to get like paid back to you in damages. So even though this is a thing and $20 has not been like inflation has not been accrued on that or accounted for in that, at the end of the day, because the attorney fees are so high, realistically, you're not going to go to court for something unless it's in the thousands of dollars, right? You're not going to try and sue for damages, reimbursement of damages, unless it's in the thousands of dollars, because otherwise you're literally just throwing your money away. You're going to get $50 from your neighbor for the fence, while you have to write a check for $2,000 to your attorney, right? So just, use a little common sense there and see what you can do with that, okay? So this is going to essentially end our rights with the courts, and we're going to transition on to other rights of yours. And really at this point, we've only got 8, 9, and 10. I'll probably do all 3 of those in a video together. And then just the 6th and the 7th together. Okay. So if you have time, go ahead and cue the next video now.